I'm originally from Moscow. I came to this country when I was 14, and then about 10 years later I went back to Moscow as an American correspondent. My parents had grown up behind the Iron Curtain. I had grown up behind the Iron Curtain. We had very, very little information about the West. We had a friend of the family who kept joking, well, do you have any evidence of the fact that the West exists? And we didn't. I mean, we had no material evidence that this wasn't a fiction. It wasn't a figment of somebody's imagination. My mother was more active than my father in the dissident movement, but neither of them went so far as to consciously risk getting arrested. And once the opportunity opened up to leave the country, they opted to leave the country. We'd spent a couple of months in refugee camps in Austria and then in Italy, which was the normal route for Soviet Jews coming out of the Soviet Union. I remember seeing things that I didn't quite understand and thinking, I just can't. I can't take it in. I don't understand what's going on, and I'm probably not going to understand what's going on for a while. When the regimes in Eastern Europe started falling, it became one of the hottest topics for journalists. And I was a young journalist. I was working in the gay press, actually, in the States. So I had just left my job to go freelance, and I thought, well, this is an opportunity for me to do something that I'm sort of qualified to do because I speak the language. It was just the most exciting place in the world to be at the time. People were talking about things that are important. Every conversation was sort of earth-shattering, and every conversation concerned something that was life-shaping. For about 10 years, I was the only openly gay public person in Russia. It was a matter of principle because I felt that there were a lot of people, most people in the Soviet Union could not afford to be out. They risked losing their livelihood, they risked losing their residence, they risked losing their family, and I didn't really risk anything. So whenever people asked, I would talk. The other story is my being an anti-Putin journalist. When I was writing a book about Putin, which was in 2010, 2011, I actually kept it secret from absolutely everybody. So the only people who knew I was working on this book were my editor in the States and my partner and my research assistant. So by the time it was publicly known that I had written a book about Putin, it was already done. And getting rid of me wouldn't have gotten rid of the book. And then in the end, I was targeted as a gay person more than I was targeted as an opposition journalist. And sort of my having been the only openly gay person in Russia sort of came back to haunt me, and they passed some laws, at least one of which I think was personally targeted at me, which was the ban on adoption by same-sex couples, which could have been used retroactively to remove my oldest son from the family. And that's when we basically had to pack up and leave. I'm very in touch with my fear. I mean, I've met people who don't have fear. In fact, because I was doing war reporting, I met quite a number of people who really did not seem to feel fear. I am not one of those people. Fortunately, I also always found it much more interesting to talk to people who are affected by war rather than the people who are actually fighting the war. At the same time, I love what I do. I'm not willing to give it up for just anything. I also wasn't, until I felt threatened, until I felt that my kids were threatened, I wasn't willing to give up my home. I think being a woman is, generally speaking, an advantage as a war correspondent. At the start of the war in Chechnya, I just parked myself in the anteway to the office of one of the generals. And no one noticed me. I was there for like 2 days. And the men would gather there and they would discuss things, and they would discuss how the war was going and where they were going to go and how they were going to negotiate. No one noticed I was there. And I think part of it was being female, part of it was being young, part of it was being small. Part of it was being unknown. Actually, one of the things that I realized I lost with age and with becoming known, especially in Russia, where people recognize me, is the ability to blend in and disappear, which is a great ability for a journalist. There's no advantage to being famous as a journalist. I think the best advice I ever got was actually when I was about to go freelance for the first time in my life, and I was very young. Whenever you get an idea, pitch it immediately. Because if you get an idea, there are 3 or 4 other reporters who got the exact same idea at the exact same minute. It's actually really good reporting advice too. Being attuned to what people are thinking, trying to catch what's in the air is actually the most important thing you can do as a journalist.